Get out!
Hello tankers and tankettes, time for another video in the What Tank series, and today I'm looking at heavies, and I've been kind of debating how to go about this because heavies are the tank type I'm most familiar with, and I'm therefore probably more aware of the variation within the different heavies in the game than I am for, say, medium tanks or tank destroyers. So I'm going to try and talk about them a little bit on a general level, and then I think what I'm going to do is take a quick look at the tech tree and look at the differences, again on quite a general level, but the differences between them, because there are kind of broadly speaking a couple. There's kind of broadly speaking two types. There's types that rely on their armor. There's types that rely on their mobility, and then you've got ones that are kind of hybrids in between. And some of them kind of have partial armor coverage, for instance, and some of them are kind of special in their own unique ways. So it makes talking about them on general, in general terms, a bit tricky. But here I am trying anyway. So, broadly speaking, very, very broadly speaking, heavy tanks are pretty much the mainstay of any force, and they are sometimes going to be the primary damage dealers, and they're probably the most flexible high damage dealers because of their turreted nature. Although in a lot of games, especially at high tiers, the primary damage dealers, the big guns, actually are found on artillery and tank destroyers. So it's hard to describe those higher tiers as being primary damage dealers, but you will see more of them in battle than other types, probably. So yeah, they are that sometimes, and it's the turreted nature of them that makes them more flexible than tank destroyers, even though tank destroyers will often have bigger guns at the higher tiers. So I will take a quick flick through, and bear in mind I do not. Oh, yeah, that's the right tab. I do not know all the tech trees. So the Chinese, for instance, I know very little of them, except that they are similar in some regards to the Soviet heavies. So kind of poor gun depression, very slopey armor, but very, very bouncy turrets, but with some weak spots. And I think some of them are prone to ammo rack damage, much like the Soviets are. Indeed, some of them are. IS-2 is very, very similar to the IS, for instance. I'm 110, I'm not sure, but yeah, they're of the kind of more brawler style heavies, the kind of get in your face and dish damage. The IS-2 maybe not so much. IS-2 is maybe more of a peekaboo, pop out and do some damage, get back to cover tank, much like the IS is. But these ones, I think you're more relying on your armor to get in people's faces and actually dish some damage. That's probably the main difference between heavies. Is some are in your face heavies, others are more medium or long range heavies. So there's that difference as well to bear in mind, and that's largely all about the armor that splits those two groups up. So we're on to the French. French are kind of an odd group of heavies. You've got BDR, which is tall, not particularly well armoured, but has a good gun. ARL is probably the best armoured until you get to tier 10, so that tells you what the armour's like on the rest of them. AMX M4 is kind of more of a medium sniper kind of tank. The Tiger falls into that category as well. And then you get the three autoloaders, and they're kind of different because they are all about burst damage. You've got an autoloader gun, you've got a clip of ammo, and you have to unload that ammo and then run away to reload, and the reload on some of these is quite long. These don't have really any armor to speak of, but they've got a hit points pool, and you are trading sometimes hit points for damage, and it's all about calculating risk. Is it worth taking the hit to unload a clip? Is there somewhere safe I can run away to afterwards? And like I said, the 50B gets a bit more hull armor, but it still has a weak turret. So these are tanks with generally armor you cannot rely on, the French heavies. So you tend to see. I've actually kept one or two. I kept the ARL, and I enjoyed playing these. They're not they're less common, I think, than say the Soviet lines. And there is actually another French tree coming at some point, which is going to be non-auto loader. Maybe have a bit armor, but we don't know too much details about that as of making this video, which is 8.7 by the way. Germans are. I've picked a bad time to talk about the Germans because the German tree is changing. The Germans are getting a tier 4, the 3001 H. That one there, that is actually becoming a totally different tank. That is moving down to tier 5 and becoming a heavy. Tier 4s we will disregard. I've actually got a Panzer, there's actually a tier 4 in the French line as well. They got a bit more armor, but the distinction doesn't matter too much at tier 4. Tier 5, the H is going to be an interesting one. It's going to have the same armor value. It's going to be slower, but it's going to get some nice guns. So that's all going to be about hanging back and sniping. 3001H, relatively well armored for its tier, so that's a medium that's becoming heavy. I think there's very little changing about that tank. It's basically going to play the same. So that's got the same frontal armor as the Tiger, actually, the same given armor value, which at tier 6 is pretty nice. There's still plenty that can hurt you, but if you angle, that's one where it can pay off quite nicely. And so yeah, and then it changes. The Tiger and the Tiger P are both actually a lot more about staying at range, sniping at the enemy. They've got nice accurate guns. The E100 line is it's kind of hard to categorize these lines exactly because they are not that coherent. Tiger 2 and the E75 both very well armored machines, both reasonably mobile, but they're getting some mobility changes, as are a lot of the German tanks in 8.8. So bear that in mind. I'm speaking about this before 8.8 has come out, and I've had a little go on the test server so far, but it's hard to test all the tanks with the current test server is a bit buggy in terms of selling tanks and getting them back and actually being able to use tanks in battle, which is a bit annoying for people that want to know how stuff is going to change. Anyway, this line culminates in E100, which is kind of reasonably well armoured and reasonably mobile for all its bulk. So you can't really say this is the armoured line because the other line finishes in the Mouse, and the Mouse has got absurd armour but a relatively weak gun. And yeah, the ones leading up to that, the 4502A, is much more of a medium play style than anything else. It's kind of relatively weak penetration for its tier, pretty weak armor for its tier, but actually quite good mobility. So the mobility is the key. You have to use that. You can't sit and face other tanks head to head. VK45, I don't have that. I know it's considered a weak tier 9, and there's a possibility Wargaming will change that at some point, but that has better guns and less mobility, more dependent on its armor, and I think the armor isn't especially brilliant, so I think that's why it's considered one of the weaker tier 9s, especially compared to the E75. Brits, we have again an interesting line. You've got 3 Churchills essentially in the middle, Churchill 1 and Churchill 7, both they're on the slow side. They don't have. They've got okay armor, given armor values. Churchill 1's got very, very easily penetrated turret. Churchill 7 gets a bit more armor, but all 3 of these are kind of they're DPM guns. They're not high alpha guns. They don't have that characteristic. They have sort of low speed, but they are very accurate, so they're quite nice firing on the move, some of them. Black Prince is actually the slowest of the 3, but it gets the best armor, and it gets an okay gun. It's not brilliant, but it's okay. The tier 8 to 10 are something different again. They are more about, as I've been saying, more about mobility. They've got okay turrets. I think the Carnarvon might have the best for its tier. I'm not sure. As you can see, I haven't played them yet. The hulls on these things are pretty weak. I think the mobility is okay. Probably the very best thing about them is the guns, which are the characteristic of British guns generally is to be relatively fast firing and relatively accurate. So the British tree generally is about rate of fire guns rather than high alpha guns and high damage guns. Although that said, there's some pretty meaty guns on the top end of the artillery line, because you couldn't really have that. Wouldn't make any sense. Non-derpy guns on artillery would just be, that wouldn't be artillery then, would it? So I think you should move on now, Jedi. I think you've convinced them you're an idiot enough. Americans, and they have probably some of the most I don't want to say interesting, well-rounded, maybe. Maybe interesting is the right word. You've got the T1 Heavy and the M6, which are like the BDR on the French tree. They're tall. They've both got really good engines for their tiers. They've both got nearly 1,000 horsepower on the top engines. Not a high top speed, but that horsepower per ton ratio means that these things go up slopes as fast as they go on the level ground, pretty much. So their mobility is not impaired by terrain that other tanks would struggle with more. They have okay guns. The American tanks are less about, they have better alpha and tend to have less accuracy, but some of them have less penetration as well, especially the T-32 is probably the one that I can single out for that. These three here, the T-34 I include, and actually the Tier 9 tank destroyer I will include in that as well, because that's again turreted, and that's a very similar hull to this group here. These are the best hull down machines in the game because they have excellent hull armor and they have very good gun depression. And the gun on the T-29 is quite good for its tier. The T-29 is probably one of the strongest tier 7 heavies. I think a lot of people, I can see why they dislike playing these two. I thought they were okay machines, although I struggled more with the M6 than the T1, but then they get to the T29 and they have a much nicer time of it. And you can also get through the medium line actually if you don't want to play those two, but you have to grind more XP on the Sherman Jumbo, which is in itself a sort of a pocket heavy tank. It's got a really sloped, quite nice frontal armor, and it's actually, for a medium, it's really good at side scraping for its tier. So yeah, a pocket battleship, if you will. The top tiers are, I'll also say the mobility of all these is quite reasonable as well. The tier 8 I mentioned, that's the same top gun as the T29. A lot of people look at that and think, oh no, that's going to be terrible. It's just about adequate. It's the turret that saves it from being a less good tank, because it's still got that combination of gun depression and reasonable mobility. The guns get a lot better at tier 9 and 10. In fact, at tier 9 you get you start off with the gun from the T29, you then get a gun that's exclusive to the M130, M103 even, and you then can research the tier 10 gun. So you can get the top tier gun at so it's like you get the tier 7 gun at tier 8, and then you get the tier 10 gun at tier 9, or that made sense in my head, kind of. You know what I mean? The tanks share guns. Anyway, they're more about mobility. It's kind of a bit strange actually, after having come off these very well armored turreted tanks, to then go on to the M103. That's much more. That's much more going back into a kind of a peekaboo tank, using the mobility, not playing it like a medium exactly, but it's not a sit and slug it out with the enemy tank, because the turret is far weaker compared to the previous ones that come before it. The top gun is pretty nice, like I said, because it's the top gun the tier 10 gets, and tier 10 guns are generally okay. The tier 10 obviously I haven't played yet, but it is, I think, it's got a pretty monstrous turret once again. Not as good as the tier 7-8 turrets, or the tier 9 in case of the T30, but it's pretty decent, and I think it's one of the favoured ones for clan wars because of the nature of its turret, and it's got a pretty decent gun mantlet. And actually it's interesting because the two tank destroyer lines at tier 10 are basically that hull with One's got a big, very slow rotating turret on it. The other one has a fixed casement. So it's the same hull across all three, basically. And then we get on. Oh, almost forgot. There is a second tier 10 heavy on the American. I always forget about this because it comes off a rather odd line. It's not a heavy line. You go light tanks, then a medium tank, then 2 light tanks, then 2 medium tanks, then a heavy tank. But this is for a reason. From tier 7 up, it's the American autoloader line, and they're kind of like the French. The T-71 is sort of comparable to... I'm not sure which of the French autoloaders, actually. As you can see, I'm working my way towards it. T-69 and T-54E1 are both relatively weak gunned, with normal ammo, I should add. All of these, I think, get premium ammo, which I think some people consider a bit overpowered at the moment. I know it's very nasty if you get a T-57 on you that's firing heat, because they just pen you everywhere, and there's not a great deal you can do about it, which is not much fun. And because it's burst damage, they can steal most of your hit points and then run away again. That's not really the case with 50B, because it this thing has got a shorter reload. The 50B is generally considered inferior compared to this thing, and the Batchat, actually, the tier 10 French medium. But people going for a tier 10 heavy tank autoloader tend to go for this thing in preference. You don't see many 50Bs around these days. So that's the other tier 10 heavy the Americans get, which is yeah, it's a nasty machine in the right hands, and it's not really like it doesn't really bear any relation to the rest of the heavy line. And anyway, as I said before, I interrupted myself because I realised I'd forgotten something. The Soviets get 2 whole lines of heavies, and they both come from the KV-1. I actually will, just as a side note, say for ages the only British tanks you could get in the game were the Lend-Lease Soviet ones, including the Churchill 3 at tier 5. So that was the only way you could play a British tank. Was there's a Matilda there as well, and the Tetrarch was a gift tank, and that was another British one. I don't know why I mentioned that. I just thought I would. The KV-1, I mean, tier 5 is really where the heavies start, and the KV-1 is kind of like the archetypal, well-armoured, relatively slow, but reasonably gunned heavy tank. And it's, if you're familiar with the KV-1, I think, I'm not sure what other, some of the British tier 6 and tier 7 are of that nature. Actually, the British tank destroyers are of that nature as well, which is slightly odd. Some of the Germans are of that nature. They are, yeah, the armour's not magic on these well-armoured tanks by any means. You know, all wargaming have made every tank have its flaws. Some of them are very, very tough frontally. Some of them less so. This is actually, as you can see, this is the heavy line I went up first, because I discovered early on I like that heavy play style. Up to a point, these are the tier 5 and tier 6 are actually you get less firepower on the T150 than the KV-1S, but not that much less. The KV-1S, of course, gets the 122mm, which may or may not be removed from it at some point. As of making this video, that's all still under discussion. I know Serb is not very keen on it, but one of the other developers was... I don't know. I think it's doing a bit too well for its tier, maybe. But the problem is the 122mm was on that tank, so if they take it off, it's probably going to piss off a lot of people, and it's going to be one of these things where it's going to be one of the more blatantly unhistorical things, but there are things like that in the game anyway, so it's not the first time ever. Anyway, this line here, which I'm more competent to speak about because I've played all of them, they're pretty slow, most of them. It's all about the armour, it's all about the angling. Once you get to tier 7, well, you get the same guns on those two. KV-4 is interesting. It gets actually kind of a snipey gun compared to other Soviet heavy guns of around that tier. STI and the IS-4. The KV-4 gets a reasonably strong turret, but it's got plenty of flat areas to hit. The STI and the IS-4 have some of the strongest turrets in the game. Well, some of the Soviet turrets generally, and some of the Chinese turrets as well. But in terms of being able to poke your turret out and actually have stuff just bounce off all day long, the STI actually has fairly good gun depression for a Soviet as well, because like I said with the Chinese, a lot of these with the low profile turrets do not have good gun depression because there was simply no room for there was not enough room for the gun to move up and down inside the tank. So you can't have it all. Yes, you've got low profile, but also you've got rubbish gun depression. So yeah, these are it's a reasonably coherent line. They all have a. It's not like you're getting. Some of the tank lines, the playstyle chops and changes. This line here, they are, by the time you play the T150, you're sort of prepared for how the KV3 plays, and so on and so on and so on. In fact, these two are really very similar indeed. The other line is more about mobility. KV1S currently with the 122mm is, for its tier, the ultimate peekaboo tank because it gets very high alpha for tier 6, for a tier 6 heavy. In fact, for any tier 6. The IS gets the same gun, basically some improved stats in other areas. IS-3 is where that line starts to change. The armor's pretty weak still, but it's a lot more angled. They get better turrets from this point as well. IS-3 is kind of a brawler. It's got its significant weaknesses, but it's a popular tank, and it's popular for a reason. It's a pretty nice machine. IS-8 is one that more plays like a medium. That is actually not unlike, what am I thinking of, the VK4502A. That's more, that is again because of the weakness of its armor. It gets pretty nice firepower. It actually gets the same gun as these two tanks, so it's getting quite a nice fire. It's an okay package. These two particularly are vulnerable to ammo rack damage, so that's something to bear in mind. And the IS-7, I think that's the one everyone goes for. Not played it myself, but it's got a very nice gun. It's got some pretty bouncy armor, but some weak spots as well to go with that. So it's I can't really compare the two because I've only played the IS-4 obviously, but they both seem like pretty decent machines. And the IS-4 actually used to be a tier 9, but they've buffed it up to being a tier 10, and it still works on the tier 10. In fact, the STI actually, it would only need a few buffs to things like health points, and it could go on tier 10 as well potentially. I think that the STI is that strong of a tank. Anyway, I think I've covered just about everything. I mean, there are some, like I said, there are some oddities, especially amongst the premiums. The TOG is probably the biggest one because it's slow with no armor. It's got a nice gun for its tier, but it only really shines when it's in a platoon, and you can double or treble up the damage per minute potential because it's a huge target, and it's got masses of hit points, but oh boy does it need them. And bear in mind, even with all those masses of hit points, you can still get two-shotted by a KV-2, for instance. And there's plenty of stuff at tier 7, and this thing does see tier 7s. You think about tier 7 tank destroyers, some of those, there's some nasty guns floating around. So that's an interesting and odd one to play. KV-2 is like on a side branch. This used to be a part of the KV, as it was called, and this was hideously overpowered at tier 5. They split the line, fortunately. It took them a long time, but they did do it. And this is basically direct fire artillery, and this is a tank that actually existed and was used. I use the derp gun because it's the derp gun, and oh my god, why would you use anything else? But it does get a 107mm option, same as the T150. It's basically a KV-1 hull still, but it's got a massive, great big derpy howitzer that can fire 152mm HE shells. Actually get like God, 80 something average pen. It'll say on the gun stats actually, won't it? It's somewhere 86 average pen on the HE shells. You know, that's pretty good. This thing used to have heat ammo, but it got removed. It's now actually got 2 kinds of AP. I don't even bother with second kind of AP. IS-6 that's another brawler, somewhat similar to the IS-3 in that regard. Some weak spots, but not bad. KV-5 is another oddity because the armor values are fantastic. It's got similar armor values to the KV-4. It's an excellent ramming machine, but it's got a massive weak spot on the front. I've done a nice review of that, so you guys should definitely check that out. Wink, wink. And autoloaders, I will do a separate video on autoloaders at some point because they're different than anything else. But yeah, so to reiterate, like I said, there's a tank for every range. You've got ones for sniping, you've got ones for hit and run burst damage tactics, you've got ones for, you know, ultimate peekaboo is this thing because you blast them in the face with a 152 HE shell and then duck back into cover for 20 seconds. You've got ones that sit out and tank it face to face with other heavies and do, you know, hopefully do some damage, but also take the damage and take the heat off your allies whilst they are able to do damage themselves. So you've got a real mixture in the heavy tanks, and hopefully this video will have given you some idea of rough play styles of what you should be doing with the various kinds of tank. But as with all these videos, this is all incredibly general, and you should, you know, if you want to know more about a particular tank, go look up reviews, because there's plenty of stuff on YouTube, there's plenty of stuff on the forums, and you know, some of it is really very, you know, I'm not going to say it's all amazing and informative, but some of it is pretty good, and you'll know the good sources already. People like Jingles and High Flyer, and you know, Quickie Baby does reasonably good reviews of tanks. Fosh has started doing reviews of tanks, so the sources are out there to look up this information. So if you thought this was a useful video, and you didn't mind me whittering on for quite as long as I have done, you can leave a comment, you can hit the like button, you can even subscribe to my channel, and of course, as always, stay tuned for more.